Thank you for joining today's webinar on an introduction to ransomware. Today's webinar is hosted by Trend Micro, a signatory of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. And for over 30 years, Trend Micro has been an unwavering vision to make the world safe for exchanging digital information. Last year, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord announced a new partnership with the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise to strengthen cyber capacity, building through the exchange of best practices. To further our commitment under that umbrella, we've launched a series of webinars to help increase the understanding of key cybersecurity topics, such as the one you will hear today. Today's webinar is presented by Jon Clay, who has worked at Trend Micro and been within the cybersecurity space for over 23 years. He's responsible for managing marketing messaging and external publications of all threat research and intelligence within Trend Micro, as well as other different core technologies. We welcome you to share your questions in the chat box to the side, located on the right part of your screen, as there will be time at the end of the presentation to address questions. And now I'd like to welcome Jon. Jon?
Yeah, thank you very much, and look forward to sharing my understanding of this topic today. Ransomware has been a very interesting topic over the last several years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the newer trends that we're seeing in the ransomware area, as well as some best practices for you. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Global Threat Communications. The interesting thing about ransomware in my 23 years, it is one of the only threats that seems to just continue and ebb and flow depending on the malicious actors behind it. But definitely we're seeing some challenges this year. You can see here, this was a story that was shared back in September. The CISA chiefs mentioning that ransomware attacks are pretty close to a large-scale cyber event. That it is definitely true that, and this came from the U.S. government, obviously, and one of the things we're seeing, and I'll talk about the trend, is that the government agencies are definitely being targeted as organizations. But as I was saying, ransomware is one of those threats that just keeps on coming. And the attackers, the malicious actors behind it, just continue to reinvent themselves. So let's take a little back look at history of ransomware. Many years ago, 10 plus years ago, we had something that was called fake AV. And this was the initial foray into this type of a threat by the malicious actors behind it. And what fake AV would do is it would pop up a message, a screen on your computer, and it would say, that you're infected. You've got, 20, 30, 60, 100 malware infections that it detected, and you needed to contact them to get it cleaned up. And they would ask you to, obviously, to use your credit card to buy a support package to be able to get that malicious code off your machine. Now, obviously, there was no malicious code on your machine. It was simply a message that popped up. It was very effective in terms of non-detection. So they were able to infect a lot of people at this time. It was a new type of threat. They used some new technology, new techniques to get it on the systems and have it pop up that weren't detected by the security industry at the time. But it wasn't very good revenue generating. People figured it out pretty quickly. They didn't pay the fee that they were asking for. So while it was good at an infection rate, it wasn't very good return on investment. That's when ransomware, the initial version of ransomware, started to hit. So what they did is, instead of popping up a fake AV, they would pop up a screen on your machine that would have some sort of law enforcement logo. In a lot of cases, that was local law enforcement. So whether it was an FBI or an Interpol or one of the regional European law enforcement agencies logo would pop up, and it would say, it would basically tell you did something wrong, something illegal, and you needed to pay a fine. And then it would take you to a page where you could pay the fine via your credit card or via some other form of payment. Now, again, this was pretty effective at the infection, but while better at revenue generating, because they were using a lot more fear to harm the victim and get the victim to pay up, it still wasn't driving enough revenue. So that's when they moved to crypto ransomware. And I'll talk about how crypto ransomware works. But this has been by far the biggest threat affecting the world over the last several years, where they decided to figure out how, by encrypting files on a machine, holding them for hostage, ransom, essentially, they were able to really increase not only their infection rate, but also their return on investment. They were getting millions and millions of dollars in revenue from crypto ransomware attacks. And we still see this today. Obviously, the motivation behind ransomware, again, in the early stages, and why they shifted from fake AV to crypto ransomware, was the return on investment. So, back in the day, we still do have spam bots, but not as much as we used to, because spam in general doesn't make a whole lot of money. They shifted to some banking Trojans. We do still see a lot of banking Trojans out there today. Obviously, if they can clean out somebody's bank account, that makes up a lot of money. But really, where the lot of the high dollar figure is coming from is crypto ransomware, and ransomware as a service now. There was an article just recently about ransomware as a service, and the Sotonokobe ransomware gang is making millions of dollars off of this threat, targeting organizations. This is an interesting thing I wanted to share with you, because it really plays into what the threat actors, the malicious actors, are doing, especially with ransomware today. And this comes from the Verizon DBIR. If you've read that report, I'm not sure if you got to the first appendix, but there's an appendix that the United States Secret Service put out information about what they found in talking to malicious actors that they've arrested over the years, and how they preyed upon their victims. And the first thing they preyed upon is human error. And as we know, human error, employee error, is one of the biggest causes of infections into an organization today, where the employee will click on a link in an or click on an attachment, an email. They'll browse places that they shouldn't be, et cetera, and really looking to fool the human side of things. The second one is IT security complacency. And this shows up in some of the industries that they're targeting, and I'll talk about that a little later. But what they are looking for is any organization that may either not have enough employees, resources available to them to do a good job of protecting their assets, their IT assets, or they become complacent, or they just don't have the ability to protect themselves as well. And then last, technical deficiencies. And this is where they look for whether it's vulnerabilities that haven't been patched, or they look for issues within the organization, within the systems that they can take advantage of. And what was also interesting, they mentioned this quote: "It is when multiple TTPs are utilized in concert that cyber criminals are able to gain and maintain access to a computer network." Excuse me. And this is showing up very well in today's ransomware attacks that we're seeing. And I'll talk about the shift and how these malicious actors have shifted their tactics to allow them to improve their infection rates. So let's go through an anatomy of a ransomware attack. Again, you have this ransomware business, excuse me, business model that's out there. And as I mentioned, it's been very successful over the years, and unfortunately will probably continue to be successful over the next several years. But the first thing that the actors behind it are going to do is some intelligence gathering. This is going to do where they identify and research the people, the organizations that they're targeting. They're going to use a number of the social media areas, LinkedIn, Facebook. They're going to use open source intelligence to identify any open IPs within that organization's network that are open up to the internet. Look for weaknesses. They're going to identify the employees that they want to target and and go after. The second step is the infection, initial infection, and this is going to be where they're going to use, whether it's a zero-day malware, which is new malware that they have just created. They're going to deliver it via some social engineering plan. So whether it's email or a document or drive-by download, some type of initial infection. It is an exploit of layer 8, which is the unwitting user. We mentioned that earlier about attack preys upon the human. So they're going to look for that initial employee inside your organization or the consumer out there. Once they infect the system, they're going to then identify the assets to be encrypted. So once the ransomware is installed, it's going to look for some specific files or file types that are of value to the victim. So for obviously for consumers, it's going to be your pictures, any banking and financial information, etc. Businesses, it might be some business critical information, etc. Something that is of value to the victim. And then they will also, though, search network shares, backups. They'll look to encrypt those as well. The fourth step is actually the encryption of files. So they're going to use the latest encryption technologies that are used by everybody else in the world. So 1024-bit or higher. We've seen 2048 being used. They'll change some of the extensions of the files to some name .xxx, or they may say it. We've seen numerous types here. So they'll encrypt those files, they'll encrypt folders, they'll encrypt backups, they'll encrypt network drives, whatever they need to do to get that system and those files and folders unreadable. They need to do a key transmission. So the private key that they use is going to encrypt the files is going to be sent back to the attacker. So this is where you get the command and control server being worked up. Command and control servers are there. That's how they maintain presence inside the connection to the organization. And the command and control server also manages the key transmission. And then lastly, the payoff, right? This is where the attacker awaits payment. Usually if paid, they will send the private key. This is where we're asked a lot, do you pay the ransom or not pay the ransom? And if you listen to the law enforcement agencies, they will recommend not paying. We don't recommend paying because every time you pay, that just contributes to the ongoing use of this attack against people and organizations. And I'll talk about how you can prevent that. But the one challenge is if not paid, some of the ransom begins deleting files, and there's usually a clock or a timer that of this is, whether it's a day, hours, days, or a week or something. But they will, and then I also get asked a lot is, do they actually send the key? In a lot of cases they do, because again, their model breaks down if they don't follow through on their promise of delivering you the decrypt key once you make payment. So obviously that is in their best interest to do it. Now, there are cases where the malware itself has a problem. They've written bad code and they can't, even the decryption key doesn't work. So you are taking a risk if you decide to pay. Let's talk about some of the recent trends that we have seen in the industry. So first and foremost, we have seen a overall drop in the number of ransomware threats detected. So this comes from our own Smart Protection Network, which is where we get information about what threats are attacking our customers. These are detections, they are not infections. So you can see here back in 2016 was kind of the big year for crypto ransomware, over 1 billion detections across our customer network. 2017 it dropped, although the number of new families increased, you can see on the right side. But we've also seen over the last several years a marked decrease in that. And I'll talk about kind of why that is, but you can see from that perspective. But first and foremost, don't be deceived by this. Ransomware still is a big business within the malicious actor underground communities. Even though it has dropped significantly, it is still making them a lot of money. They are just changing some of the tactics that they use. So the big transition, there's been a transition in terms of how these actors are targeting, what types of organizations they're targeting, how they're infecting the organization, and all of that. We'll talk a little bit about that here. First and foremost, there's a bigger and deeper attack surface. So what that means is they are looking for organizations that they can target. They are definitely going after businesses now. Because businesses are more likely to pay a higher ransom. The attack surface obviously has grown for them. They are looking at different options to attack within the organization. They aren't just infecting and using ransomware on the initial infection of the employee's system. In the past, that was where they started, but we have seen definitely a shift there. Some examples that we have seen recently, Megacortex. This is one where it actually spread via a compromised domain controller. So one of the things that they are looking to do is how they can improve their lateral movement or their infection rate across the organization and the systems within that organization. So this method where they will get first initially infect a employee's system, but once they get that beachhead in there, they will then quickly laterally move and look for your domain controllers to compromise. Once they find your domain controller, they compromise it. That allows any system that connects to the domain controller to have the ransomware be installed on those systems. So definitely being targeted inside those enterprise accounts. CLOP ransomware used compromised Active Directory. So again, a different type of, not the domain controller, but the Active Directory server to spread. So again, they're looking for if I can compromise some of these key servers that connect to all of your systems or many of your systems, then they have the ability to compromise a lot more of the business critical systems. Ryuk is another ransomware family that we have seen recently that gained admin access using PowerShell. So this is PowerShell, if you're not familiar, is a fileless attack. So this doesn't require an actual file to be installed. They're using PowerShell. They're using some of the original tools that are out there, network tools, system tools that you utilize as an organization, and they'll use that to move laterally within the organization and infect other machines. And then the last one is Locker Goga, where it used system administration tools to plant itself on the system. So again, this is where they're trying to deceive an organization because they're using the same system administration tools that you utilize as an organization, as an IT professional. They'll use the same ones to try to hide their tracks. So definitely seeing that as well as within the organizations. So they've definitely gotten a much better at targeting types of organizations. Their evasion techniques are much more effective these days, the obfuscation techniques that they're using. Some of the things that they're doing today now, for example, instead of having one process that encrypts multiple files and all of the files, they will start up a new process every couple of files that they encrypt and restart a new process to do that, because some of the behavior monitoring technologies that are out there were looking for multiple files being encrypted in a short period of time. So if it found 20 files being encrypted in a short period of time, they would kill that process. The other aspect, another one that they're doing is instead of doing it just for like 10 files, they'll do it for every single file. So this makes it a much more difficult process of detecting. They are targeting more critical systems within an organization. So this allows them to target systems that are running the business operations or running a manufacturing line. Because if they can encrypt and make those systems unavailable, that organization is much more likely to pay. Hospitals, healthcare organizations are being targeted because of the business critical systems that they have, that they need online all the time. So they are definitely looking at that. they're using some legitimate software on occasion to install. So they'll have a pop-up message that'll say, "Hey, I'm installing this file or this application." It's usually an application that you're using, and to fool the user thinking that they're installing a legitimate software. The other one is a distribution model. We've seen recently some MSPs being infected, which then they were able to infect the supply chain, software supply chain. So, for example, if it's an update, they may infect the update server. So all of that organization's customers can be infected as well. So looking for different ways, but certainly the old model where you use ransomware to infect the first system that you get install on inside an organization is gone. They are really following the targeted attack or APT type of tactic, where they will infect that initial employee system, but then immediately lateral move across the organization looking for those business critical systems, use the ransomware to make those systems unusable or unreachable. And then that allows them to get that organization to pay the ransom much more effectively. So again, we're going to see that steady decline. We think we're going to continue to see the targeted attack approach, which means they are not going to do the spam or the phishing attacks on a regular basis for targeting multiple organizations or users out there in the world. They're going to be much more diligent in their approach, much more diligent and rigorous in who they are attacking. And if you look here, this comes also from our data. You can see the vertical industries that were being targeted over the last 2.5 years. And as you can see, the top ones for every year have been manufacturing, healthcare, and government. And if you've been following the news, you can see that kind of bearing truth. Most of the organizations that have been targeted and successfully compromised this year have been in manufacturing, healthcare, and government. Education is one other area that we're seeing, and we saw just recently some school systems being targeted, school districts being targeted. And again, you think about who they were targeting and how they target it. Those 3 areas that the Secret Service mentioned, all 3 of those are areas that these industries have challenges with. So we're going to continue to see that. Now, when we do think about the future, a lot of people talk about IoT, but when you think about consumer IoT, there's really no value in ransoming a consumer IoT device, because most people who maybe pay $100 or $200 are not going to pay $1,000 or $5,000 ransom they'll just replace it. What we will see and we'll start seeing is the extortion around industrial IoT. Industrial IoT devices are being used more and more by organizations to either run manufacturing lines, run operations, etc. If they can start compromising those devices and bring those devices down, the likelihood that they'll be able to extort ransom to get those systems back up and running quickly is much higher in the future. So for those organizations that utilize industrial IoT devices, you want to be on the lookout there. So let's shift now. I've talked a little bit about the ransomware threat landscape. Let's talk a little bit about mitigation. This is what a lot of you are more interested in, I think. Obviously, ransomware, a big challenge with it is it disrupts your business, right? Halts productivity. You lose a lot of data. It can be a damage to your brand. Your customers may be concerned about it if they find out you get infected with it. There's legal and regulatory implications that are associated with it. As I mentioned, more and more we're seeing them utilize a targeted attack or a data breach type of model. So legal and regulatory implications are going to come in. So let's talk about some of the fundamental best practices. These are necessary but not sufficient. So you can't get away with just doing these, but first and foremost, back up and restore. We recommend a 3-2-1 model, which is 3 copies, 2 formats, and 1 air gap from the network. The reason it's air gapped, I mentioned earlier, that they will search for network shares and backup shares. So if those are online, they will likely encrypt all the files in those backup shares. So make sure you have at least one air-gapped copy laying around. Keep current with patching. More and more, we are seeing some of the malicious actors in this space, the ransomware actors, utilize exploits of known vulnerabilities. WannaCry and NotPetya are two examples that use the Eternal Blue exploit and affected millions of systems out there. So make sure you keep current with patching or utilize virtual patching. Access control is a great way to limit the access to some of this business critical data. We've seen in the past where they are looking at targeting some of the POS devices, et cetera. So if you can utilize access control, it's a great option for you, especially for those systems that are very business critical for you. And then last, employee education, right? I mentioned that we will still continue to see your employees be targeted in the initial infection. So educating them, awareness, best practices, simulation testing, et cetera, on these phishing attacks. But when we talk about a multiple layers of protection, I'm going to talk about 4 different layers. This is your best practice in terms of securing your organization effectively. First and foremost, email and web gateway. We know that, and through our data, we know that 98% of ransomware is going to come via email or web. So first line of defense, look at securing your email and web gateways. The next step is your endpoints. Also look at your network. I mentioned they are now laterally moving across your network. So having some form of network analysis, network analytics. And then lastly, your servers, because again, from the endpoint, they will laterally move to your business critical systems. And then in a lot of cases, those are your servers or your data centers that you have within your organization. So let's look a little closer at each of these areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technologies you can look at and utilize in these areas. So at the email and web protection, this is your gateway. Look at spear phishing protection. This is technologies that can identify very targeted phishing emails. Many cases, it's going to utilize artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies that will be able to identify that. Malware scanning, so scanning the ransomware emails, the attachments. In a lot of cases, in the past, some of your email scanners only utilized signature scanning. Nowadays, you can get machine learning technology to scan the attachments, so look for that. Email and web reputation. This is where you block the access to the spam and malicious URLs at their source. So again, keeping them away from the endpoint, as far away from the endpoint as possible. So, and then lastly is if you're looking at email and web, use some kind of a sandbox that can scan those attachments and those URLs first before they are delivered to your end users. So the first line of defense, definitely at the gateway. Keep this ransomware threat as far away from your endpoints and your servers as possible. The second area is endpoint. Again, the initial infection is going to be targeting your endpoint users. Deploy a very broad range of technologies, next-gen technologies. So behavior monitoring, I mentioned that earlier. It is effective in a lot of cases. So detect and stop unauthorized encryption of those files. Starting to look at how ways to identify if they are opening up new processes, as I mentioned earlier, to encrypt either one file or multiple files. Vulnerability shielding, I mentioned you need to patch or virtually patch those systems that have vulnerabilities associated with them. Application control at the endpoint is always good. And then AI, machine learning. These are some of the more advanced technologies that are available today on your endpoint security solutions. So take a look at that, both pre-execution and post-execution, right? So either before the file runs or even during runtime. On the network layer, you can detect and block it from spreading using network monitoring. So you have technologies today that can sit in line with within your networks. It can monitor all the different network ports, all the different protocols, using pattern reputation analysis, script emulation. There's zero-day exploit and command and control detection at the network layer. A custom sandbox. I mentioned sandboxing earlier, but I wanted to highlight the customization that you need to do. We've seen examples where a piece of malware was created only to run in a certain environment, customer environment. So a custom sandbox allows you to actually build a simulation of your exact system setup. So if you're running English, if you're running Portuguese, if you're running French, it doesn't matter. You can set it up and run in those environments. If you're running IE instead of Chrome, you can set that up, for example. So again, these as the malicious actors get more and more customized in their approach, they will identify your organization. They'll identify what systems you run, what applications you run, what operating systems you run, and they will build their malware to only run in those environments. So that's why a custom sandbox option is critical for you. And then lateral movement detection. This is where you have IDS, IPS rules to detect and block some of that lateral movement that the attackers are doing. And then server protection. Again, servers are your critical systems. It is different in this area because in a lot of cases, obviously on your servers, you probably don't have email being looked at on servers. You probably aren't browsing the web on those servers, but the actors know how to get on these systems in ways different ways than they get on the typical user endpoints. So you want to definitely have malware scanning. Again, that's going to involve machine learning technologies that can scan, behavior monitoring that can scan, etc. Vulnerability shielding is critical in this area because they will most likely try to infect or compromise the server using a known vulnerability to get on there. Suspicious action monitoring. So you have technology that looks for suspicious activity on file servers related to ransomware. And then command and control detection. So again, this is across all these different systems where you can identify if there is a connection to a command and control server. And if there is, you can block access to that command and control so it can't serve up certain, whether it's the key, whether it's sending the key down or sending the information back to the criminal. And then one other item I wanted to highlight is the educate employees on phishing. This is a phishing simulation that we offer called Phish Insight. It's a free service to you that you can utilize to run simulations for your employees. It's very easy and simple to utilize. There's a number of these technologies out there, these services out there, but I just wanted to highlight this as an option. And then last, I wanted to highlight some of the resources that are available. There is if you haven't seen the nomoreransom.org website, I recommend you go to that website. This is one of the first places you go if you happen to be infected, because they offer a number of decryption options for a lot of the ransomware that are out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the newer ransomware utilize some of the newer encryption technologies and key transmissions, so it makes it much more difficult to do the decryption. But there are, and this is supported across the industry, so there's a lot of very smart researchers out there from all organizations, not just Trend Micro, that are helping support this. So take a look here. It gives you some information. And then the last area is just, again, education on ransomware. We've got a lot of information on our site, trendmicro.com. This is an example of our definition page where you can get a lot of information. There's some research reports, there's videos, there's infographics, all of that are available here. And then we also blog regularly about ransomware on our security intelligence blog. This will give you information about what the new ransomware is, how does it work, what are the ways to detect it, etc. So With that, I want to thank the Tech Accord for giving me the opportunity to present here. And we're ready to take some questions if there's any.
If there are any questions at this time. So with that, I'd like to wrap up this webinar. Thank you all for attending. This video will also be uploaded to YouTube within a day or so. And thanks so much, John, again.
Thank you all.
Have a good day. Thanks. Bye.
Yep.